Welcome everyone to this wonderful podcast again.
I'm trying to remember whether it's called LEAFline or grieve-line.
No, I was just messing around. Hi everybody, welcome in. Glad you're here. Thank you for joining us again. I am Brian Ralston, associate to the pastor here at Seminary. Across from me, physically distanced, is Ben Aquina. He's all things tech, modern worship, and just an all-around great guy here at Seminary.
I'm the director of music and nerd ministries.
There you go. So thank you for joining us. Welcome in.
And we love hearing from people, so if you have things to say to us, please write them in an email to centenary1911@gmail.com. That email address is in the description below.
Can I get an update?
We are finally going to be reopening for in-person gatherings on June 21st. Initially, the only thing reopening will be our Sunday services. They'll be at 9 a.m. and 11 a.m., and there will be tons more information going out in the near future about that. One thing that we want to start getting across is we would love to have RSVPs from people so we know who to expect and who not to expect. This is not registering. You're not selecting seating or anything like that. It's not super even meticulous. It's really helpful to us if we definitely know you're planning on being there or if we definitely know you're not.
He has notes, folks. He is literally working from notes, and still he sounds like that sometimes. That's just our wonderful Ben.
Thank you, Ben.
And we will be continuing live streaming because we understand there are many of our church family who are not going to feel comfortable coming back quite yet, or have some other reasons they would like to still be at home to worship. So we're going to be joining together live worship still. Live streaming will be continuing on the 21st and 28th.
Indefinitely.
Indefinitely, yes. That's a new reality for us. We will be having live streaming services every Sunday, as well as our in-person services right now. So both will be happening starting June 21st. So you pray about it, you talk with your loved ones, and you decide what is best for your situation. We understand that coming back to church will not be as we remember it from February and beyond, just because of the precautions that have to be taken. So coming back to church will not be the same. So you may still choose to be at home for a bit because of caution or other reasons. Feel free. We respect those choices. We extend grace to you and love you either way. So whether you come back to join us in person or join us on the live stream, you're part of the church family.
And if you choose to watch the live stream and you lose the email that was sent to you, you can always find the stream at centenarychurch.net/live. And for those of you that are not going to be joining in-person services, most of our other video production is going to be continuing at the regular schedule. Podcast, video, devotionals, that stuff's all going to continue at least through the end of the month of June. Why at the end of the month of June, Brian?
Because we'll have a new pastor starting July 1st. So Pastor Tim will be joining us and leading us starting July 1. Pastor Bob retires officially June 30th. So we're just kind of not sure what the new reality is going to be.
He might have some new ideas he wants us to pursue. But at least until the end of June, you'll be getting the same regular content. And we'll probably be doing some additional online content after that. So we'll just have to wait and see. And if you are able to join us, Pastor Bob's final service in person will be Sunday, June 28th.
Interruption.
So normally at this point in the podcast, we would have the story segment. And when we recorded the podcast this week, Brian told an amazing story. It was delightful, entertaining, wonderful, heartwarming. Unfortunately, it was also 8 minutes long. Normally not a problem, but when we finished recording our podcast this week, we'd recorded for 53 minutes. And we need to cut some weight somewhere, so that story will be happening in next week's podcast episode, episode 13. So I hope you will listen to that when it happens. But for now, we're skipping stories. On to what's next.
Recommendations. Give it a try.
Oh, recommendations. What you reading, Brian? What you watching? Do you want me to go first?
You go first, Ben.
I got back into into reading Pride and Prejudice. I kind of put it down for a couple months. I don't have that much time to read right now, but I was tired of using that excuse, and it's just such a wonderful, wonderful book. It's amazing.
That's cool. That's very cool. That is a good book. It's been a long time since I read it, but I actually, for some reason, again, I'm in this weird phase of rereading books that I've enjoyed, and so I actually started reading some Charles Dickens. A Tale of Two Cities is a... I know. It's ridiculous.
Amazing.
But
it's awesome.
I love The Tale of Two Cities, so for some reason I started reading that again, and I really enjoyed it. So some classics there, and then I'm still rereading some detective suspense kind of stories that I enjoy that are set in Australia. And so the combination of that is I don't seem to be enjoying American stories right now. For some reason I'm either in England or I'm in Australia. But yeah, it's been really enjoyable.
I have a very close friend with a master's in literature that almost can never bring herself to read American stuff.
I know, it's interesting.
But yeah, Dickens, like, he's kind of got that Austen gift where he just crafts these really fascinating characters that are so layered. It's
so if it's been a while
does
since
such
you've
great
read some
work in
Dickens,
character.
there are some books that are drudgery to get through, but most of them are really good and really hold up. And so, yeah, give it a try. It's been kind of enjoyable for me. So I guess that's a recommendation too. If you haven't read any Dickens
give it
ever,
a try.
don't make it a school project or something. But there are some really good books that you could venture into from old Darl's Chickens.
And he's done some short stories too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, short stories that aren't that short, but they're really good. So Dickens is famous for wordiness, and I love it. But he's definitely wordy.
It's definitely a difference when you're reading a writer. You're like, okay, this guy loves words. This guy loves language, and like this is his sandbox here.
Yeah.
And with Dickens, one of the things that's really interesting about him is the social commentary. How his work is thoroughly, completely entertaining, but he's also using it as a platform to really speak out against the social evils of the time. And the one that first comes to mind is boarding schools.
Yeah.
Like the idea that these poor parents are scraping together whatever money they can to send their kid away to get an education, and then you find out that it is just a horror house of abuse.
Yeah. It's really helpful, and I know it sounds heavy, but it's really not. They're very enjoyable stories too.
That's the weird thing.
He makes it. I don't know how he does it, but he makes them enjoyable.
It's so cartoony.
You love the characters, but at the same time, there is definitely a deeper point that is being made too. And they've held up well. They're really, really good books. So, what you recommend, Ben?
Well, oddly enough, as we talk about Dickens, there's a TV show that I'd love called Doctor Who about a time-traveling alien that's got a really strange interest in Earth. In one episode, he encounters Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens finds out that this guy's a time traveler, and his question is, my books, how long do they last? And the doctor delightfully looks him in the eye and says, forever. And, oh man, I'm getting chills just thinking about that. But I'm actually going to talk about Doctor Who today. I'm going to recommend an episode of Doctor Who. It is called Blink. It is Season 3. Depending on whether you have the American version or the English version, it's Episode 10 or Episode 11 of Season 3. The episode is called Blink. It doesn't matter if you don't like sci-fi. It doesn't matter if you've never seen Doctor Who anymore. There's a lot of backstory for this show because it's been around for like 50 years, but the episode Blink is entirely standalone and works as just a single little essay of amazing storytelling. It's $1.99 to rent on Amazon Prime Video. If you rent it and don't like it, I will mail you $2 because I would love for just more people to see this episode. It is an incredible standalone, just amazing expression of the art form of short video storytelling.
It's a money-back guarantee.
Money-back guarantee from Ben. Up
like
to
it.
3 people that tell me they hate this episode will...
$2 from Ben, yeah.
One of the great things about Doctor Who is, even though it's science fiction, the best work that Doctor Who typically does is writing characters and aliens and creatures that prey on primal fears. And in this one, it's this primal fear of statues that is kind of universal for a lot of people, just being creeped out when you see a statue. So Blink is the episode, and Brian is going to make fun of me now, and that's okay. I deserve it.
Yeah, whatever. You're director of modern worship and nerd areas, so there you go. It's right in your nerd ministries. You're good.
Yes.
We're good.
Trivia. Okay, so last week we had 2 trivia questions. I am delighted to say both of them were answered correctly by our listeners. The literature question: in Kenneth Graham's The Wind in the Willows, Mr. Toad is obsessed with automobiles. What onomatopoeic phrase does he utter the first time he hears a backfiring car tear down a country road? Listener Kristen wrote in the correct answer. She even spelled it correctly. Poop poop.
Gee, I wonder who the Kristen was. Gee, you have any knowledge of her?
I don't
perhaps?
know, but she's probably smart and attractive.
Okay.
Okay, now in the category of sports, the question was, what World Series was interrupted by a major earthquake that devastated the city it was played in? And Brian, I believe you knew this one offhand.
I
mentioned it to you
I
last
remember. It's one of those moments that if you're into sports at all, you remember where you were when you saw that stadium rocking and shaking.
I'll tell you
and it
who
was
else
pretty
knew the
disturbing.
answer. It was Joyce Uziak. She
Yay!
sent in the correct answer at 9:06 a.m. on the morning that podcast was released. So kudos to you.
So Bob and Joyce are on it. They're listening to the podcast. Way to go. You got the trivia and
Thank
you jumped on it.
UZX.
Wish there was a prize, but there isn't. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, Randall Robinson would also get the prize because he wrote in 1989, he specified it was Game 3. And because the series was between the Oakland Athletics and the San Francisco Gigantics, it was often fondly referred to as the Battle of the Bay.
I don't think Randall was old enough to remember that, so it must have been before he was born or something, but yeah.
Okay.
Anyway.
So we have one new trivia question this week. Brian has not heard it yet. I wonder if you'll know this. Pro sports in California is the category. In the late 1980s, a key member of the San Francisco Giants organization and a key member of the San Francisco 49ers organization, two different people, had the exact same first and last name. What was the name? Who were the guys? Do you know this off the top of your head?
I do not think I know this one.
Okay.
That's interesting.
And hint, I say the two organizations because one of them was not an active athlete at the time. So that is the trivia question for this week, and we're moving on to main topic.
Main topic.
So today's main topic may sound a little strange in the timing of all this. So stay with us even when you hear that we're talking about grief today, grieving and the grieving process.
Welcome to GriefLine.
Yeah, this is not going to change the name of the podcast, though we're tempted. We just thought it'd be helpful to visit the topic of grief, as it is very common in everyone's experience. If you have lived long enough, you have grieved. You've grieved the loss of loved ones and maybe very close family and friends. Maybe the loss of significant health issues, but grief is just a part of human life, and from a young age we start grieving because it's just what happens. Things and people that we love die, experiences end, even our health begins to change in significant ways. So Ben and I, for our ages, have experienced a lot of grief, not anywhere close to some in our church family that we know of. So we're not, comparing ourselves. We're just saying that we're not experts on this by any means, but we thought it'd be helpful to just have a chat about grief, and we'll kind of just give a brief biblical foundation of it, and then talk about some personal experiences and just some ways to think about grief. So stay with us for that. And the biblical foundations are interesting because grief is a common human experience, and it's just part of our reality. You want to cut that out?
Not really.
All right.
I want to make fun of you for it, but
everything.
I can't think of anything clever.
I have silenced everything, but yet still they ring. Anyway. So grief in the scriptures, death is just a reality for us humans. So we see grief being dealt with by Jesus. One of the
Well, name one verse of at least 5 words or less. Sorry.
Yeah. So we could get to the 1 Thessalonians verse.
Yeah, do that. Do you want me to look it up?
1 Thessalonians 4:13. If Ben wants to look that up for me, sure. That way we can get it word perfect. But 1 Thessalonians 4:13, the Apostle Paul was writing to the church in Thessalonica, and there was some confusion because they had thought the second coming of Jesus would happen sooner. And so, being that they had waited now several decades, poor people, try several millennia, but they were getting concerned because some people that had believed in Jesus and followed Jesus very faithfully had died, and so they didn't know what would happen. And so the Apostle Paul is writing to them and saying,
now, dear brothers and sisters, we want you to know what will happen to the believers who have died, so you will not grieve like people who have no hope.
So what I love about that is we as Christians, we grieve with hope. We don't grieve as those who have no hope. So in other words, those who don't have Jesus, they don't have that eternal confident expectation that God will keep his promises. And what that refers to is Jesus talking about himself as the resurrection and the life. That comes out of John 11. And he's saying to people in the midst of grieving, Mary and Martha had lost their dear brother Lazarus, who was a good friend of Jesus. He's very good friends with all three of them. And he's saying to Martha that truly, if you believe in Jesus Christ, he is the resurrection, he is the life. Life is available to you now, Martha, but also life eternal. And your brother believed in me and had faith in me, thus he has eternal life also. And so that promise is made many times in the scriptures. And so Paul's referring to that, saying, we Christians, we in Jesus grieve with hope, a confident expectation that...
Such an important distinction, because one of the wrong messages that's kind of sort of gotten filtered through time is we have hope, therefore grieving is a sign of a lack of faith.
Right, exactly. That's why I love that particular verse in 1 Thessalonians, because it talks about grieving is normal. Grieving is part of the process, regardless if you're a Christian or not. You just grieve differently than the world around you.
Even Jesus with the sisters of Lazarus, he tells them that truth, and then he goes to the tomb and cries.
Yeah. What's awesome about the story in John 11, if you want to look that up, it's John 11:17 to the end of the chapter. Jesus is meeting with first Martha and then Mary, and he's interacting with them in the worst days of their lives. After they've lost their brother, they're grieving deeply, but they're grieving so differently. Martha ends up standing and having a full conversation with Jesus. They talk theology, they talk just a whole bunch of stuff. But yet Martha says, Lord, if you had only been here, my brother would not have died.
It's interesting because one of the classic stages of grief is bargaining.
Yeah.
And oh man, did she pick the right guy to bargain with.
Right. And she basically is, in that statement, she's crying out with such pain and suffering and loss. And there's some anger there too. It's bargaining, it's anger, it's all of that in the same statement. And yet Jesus interacts with her, and he has this conversation, and he essentially validates her grief. He doesn't say stop grieving and start believing. He doesn't say that. He basically just says, let me walk you through this about where you find hope in the midst of your grieving. He doesn't condemn her for grieving. He actually just meets her where she is and helps her to find hope. And by the end of that conversation, she's affirmed her belief in him as Messiah. And I think she's comforted in her grief. Her grief doesn't go away at that moment, even though we know how the story ends and Lazarus does return to life through Jesus' power. He's resurrected. But Jesus doesn't reveal that to her at that point. So her grief is still present, but now she has hope in the midst of the grief. Then he meets with Mary, and Mary is totally different. Mary is grieving to the point where she can't speak. She basically is just crying and emotional and just flings herself at Jesus' feet and is crying on the ground. And she says the same words Martha said, Lord, if you'd only been here, my brother would not have died. But it's from a much different emotional place, and she's just grieving in a different way. Jesus doesn't condemn her for grieving, and he doesn't prescribe to her, oh, you should grieve like your sister grieves. No, he meets her where she is.
He doesn't do the disciple thing, why don't you have any faith?
No.
He says that to his disciples sometimes.
Yes, he does. But not to Mary Martha, because grieving is different and unique in every individual. It's reflected by your personality and your wiring and your experience and your history. Mary's grieving differently from Martha. Jesus meets her in that grief and again walks with her to find the hope. And for her, the hope is that Jesus is with her. He doesn't really try to talk with her. There's no extended conversation there. He just grieves with her. And that's when the famous verse, Jesus wept, comes in, 11:35. And people are confused by why he's weeping. Some are saying, oh, he's weeping because,
because he feels so much sympathy for the sisters.
Yeah, he feels so much sympathy. Others are saying, but he's the only one in the crowd that really gets what's going to happen. He's going to resurrect Lazarus.
And Steve Collins taught on this passage years ago, and the Greek for that word really sort of eliminates the ambiguity we get from English. And I remember him teaching the word was enebrimzato, and he said that was described as being deeply troubled.
Yeah, that comes in the next verse, that Jesus is indignant in his spirit.
Oh, yeah, indignant.
It's not Jesus wept, it's the next verse, but it's the same. That's okay, it's the same segment. He actually gets angry about death. He gets indignant. He's not angry at Mary or Martha or the crowd. He's angry.
Like gripping his fist saying, this is wrong!
Yeah, the death is
I'm going to fix it.
It's not part of God's original design. And Jesus, as God, is angry at this death thing that causes us humans so much pain and so much difficulty. And he knows that he's about to resurrect Lazarus, but he also knows just in a very short time he's going to go to the cross and defeat death forever and cause death to have a very limited timeline of power over us, and how the hurt that death brings will have an end to it. And it's not just an endless infinite hurt. It's going to be defeated, and Jesus knows that. So it's both connected to Lazarus. He knows Lazarus is going to be resurrected, but he also knows that Lazarus will die again someday. The physical body of Lazarus will go through death again, as we all will, and he just knows that that's partially what he's talking about with the anger issue, is death is a big enemy of us humans, and he's about to defeat it. And yes, you heard Ben's phone in the background, so there you go. So there you go. That's a quick biblical sketch for you. The one verse I want to end with is Psalm 23:4. which has always been very special to me. I know many of you love Psalm 23, but Psalm 23:4 talks about when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil.
Because I'm not going to walk through the valley of the shadow of death.
Yeah, that's what's interesting. When I walk through the valley of shadow of death, it's going to happen to us all. And so personally, either we're going to, we know we're all going to die, or loved ones that we are very close with are going to die. So whenever you're going through that experience, Psalm 23 is very helpful because it reminds us that we're never alone. God is with us, the Good Shepherd is with us, and we don't have to fear anything in those moments of darkness. And the part that I always love is we're walking through the valley. We're not taking up residence. It may feel like it's a permanent dwelling, that we're building a house in the valley of the shadow of death. That's not the reality. Even if the walking feels very slow, even if it feels like you're crawling, God is moving you through grief, because grief is a journey. It is a process. It is not a permanent state. And some of us may feel like it is because, it is so painful and so deep wounds sometimes. And it may take quite a long time, but God will always heal those wounds into scars. You won't be like you were before, but you will be healed if you let God's light heal you, if you let God take you through that process. Because it is a process. Grief is a process. The psychology tells us those 5 stages of grief that are so famous: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And those are not meant to be a chronology of first this, and then you'll just proceed right through it. 5 easy steps to grief. No,
you can kind of Fred Astaire your way up and down those steps.
Yeah, exactly. It's not in any way a predictable process. It is not meant to be some sort of, okay, I checked the box, now I move on. No, it may come and go. It may ebb and flow. It may, like the tide, it comes in heavier some days, and other days it doesn't.
Yeah, I sort of have some notes written down. I wrote down this caption: Ben's unqualified observations regarding grief. And the first one on there is grief shows up when and where it feels like it. And I remember feeling sort of some pressure from some family members. Like I lost my dad in 2014. And this thing of, this is the 1-year anniversary of his death. Are you okay? It's like, yeah, I'm totally fine. But then, 6 months later, I'd be parked at a stoplight, and I would look at the stop sign and I'd be like, oh.
Yeah.
And it would just hit me at really inopportune moments sometimes. And, on observations, when you think you're supposed to feel something, nothing might come, and that's fine too.
Yeah. It's not predictable, and it's not going to be faithful to a calendar. Sometimes it'd be easier if it was. Sometimes it'd be harder. Sometimes anniversaries and dates and things like that really do have significant grief attached to them, but sometimes they don't. And so no one needs to put pressure on others in that sense. We somehow want to do that, though, because we think that that's what caring looks like, is to... But
if I can just get this person to stop crying,
right,
then I've done my job.
Right.
Yeah.
And the reality is that the best thing to do with grief is just to be with someone. You can't fix it for them. You can't take it away. You cannot often even minimize it or lessen it. You just you being there. And I've always been comforted by what Jesus does with grieving, in that he just sometimes is just there. He's just present. And that's Jesus. He could do amazing things. And sometimes he just chooses to be present with those who are grieving.
And when you encounter a grieving person and you're trying to, you're treating it like a project, you're trying to tell them this thing, tell them that thing, it puts a ton of pressure on that person. Because now they're sort of in a position where they have to change in order to make you feel better about your efforts.
Right,
and
right.
It's kind of an unfair thing.
Yeah, so the best thing, again, the advice I always give people with those, to walk with someone through grieving is just be there and take your cues from the person. Just try to take your cues from the person who's grieving, and don't necessarily prescribe or think that you know what to do, because even in your own experiences, even if you're quite experienced with grief, your way of coping with it may not work for someone else. So even as a pastor, I very rarely give advice and formulas as to do this and do that when it comes to grief, because it's so unique and different for every situation. So my main role is just to walk with someone through it. And it is a challenging role, so don't step into it unless you are willing to do the work that it takes. Are we going to be bothered by the bells?
Nah.
Okay. Where do you want to go next?
Do we want to share our weird stories about grief?
Yeah.
Okay, I've got one that taught me a really, really powerful lesson about one of the unqualified observations about grief, and it was my mom's side of the family is from New Zealand, and in 2009, 2008 maybe. 2008. One of those years, I went to New Zealand, and my grandma had passed away, I think, 18 months earlier. I didn't know her that well because I'd lived my entire life in California, and she was still in New Zealand when she passed away. But when we got to the graveyard, something just really, really powerful swept over me. Like, we parked the car, and my foot hit the grass, and I started feeling kind of wobbly. And before we were even in sight of her grave, I just started exploding liquid out of every hole on my face, and it was disgusting. It was such undignified grief. I was just a faucet. We didn't, like, at one point we had to walk back to the car and get paper towels because I didn't bring any tissues, because why would I? Like,
you didn't expect to grieve.
I was there to pay respect.
Right.
It wasn't that I had this emotional burden that I needed to, or so I thought. And so what I wrote down is, grief is primal, visceral, powerful, and not always logical. And it is a potent, real force, and somehow my blood knew that my blood was buried in the ground there.
Yeah, exactly. And there are times when situations you're not able to grieve for various reasons, but sometimes your body, your mind, your spirit, your emotions are going to break through regardless. So just be aware of that.
And if they don't, that's okay too.
And if they don't, that's okay too, exactly. Yeah. It may happen, it may not.
They'll come when they need to.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're trying to deal with grief in a healthy way, just be open and be aware that it may clobber you at times, and that's okay. That's normal. There's nothing wrong with you. It doesn't mean you're a psycho. And so I love that story partially because Ben was with Kristen, and she didn't run screaming from that experience. She embraced him, and she helped him because she understood, wow, this was unexpected, but at the same time, it's normal. It's just part of life. And yeah, we didn't plan for this, we didn't expect this, but it happened, and so let's deal with it.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid or scared off by those kind of things, because sometimes
and it can actually be really valuable and important to kind of let them run their course when they do show up. Because I got another story about a time when I didn't.
Ben's dad was a pretty special man, a pretty special individual, and I actually was honored to attend his Celebration of Life service, the service that his family and Ben put together.
You, Pastor Bob, and Wendy Blair all showed up for that. That was wonderful.
Yeah. And what was great about that was it was a festive celebration of George's life in a lot of ways, and there was a lot of music and a lot of just really awesome stuff. But Ben was very involved with it. I'll let you tell your own story. I just wanted to give the background that I
thought you were doing a great job. Yeah, I was asked by my mom to lead worship there, so I rehearsed with a band, and I was there with my suit on, and actually we had just a dinner available to all the people that were helping in the service, an hour before the thing started. And I had to leave that dinner and go just stand behind one of those awkward, like, accordion board stand-ups in their fellowship center because I just started blubbering. And, the food looked really delicious. I didn't get to eat any of it. I was bummed about that. But, like, it was just this awareness of, oh, man, this powerful thing is coming over me. And one thing about me is when it comes to, I'm kind of an old theater guy. The show must go on. And so we get there, and the service is starting, and I'm sitting there in the pews, and my aunt, my dad's side of the family's from Hawaii, my aunt is up on stage doing this gorgeous, breathtaking hula dance, and she's crying, and it's this beautiful, dignified expression of grief, and I start blubbering sitting there in the pew. But I'm also looking at the program saying, I have 4 minutes before I have to go up there and lead worship. I can't even speak right now. And in that moment, I just sort of made this decision to go with my professional instincts and just squash it. Just get down there. No, not right now. And I managed to suppress it, and I got up on stage, and I led my songs, and I sang and played very well. I went back to my seat, and I just felt completely emotionally detached from the remainder of the service. We were like 25 minutes into a 90-minute service, and from that point forward, I had just kind of completely disconnected from my grief at that moment. And now I was, a professional worship leader just running out the clock. And it was strange. And so that really taught me that, that was not a good thing for me in the long run to be professional and suffer through it. And
I was going to mention that you intentionally turned off your emotions, and unfortunately you were too good at it, and you couldn't turn them back on, essentially, and so you missed an opportunity that would have been a very cathartic.
Yeah, when I had started crying when my aunt was doing the hula, like there was this sort of catharsis happening.
Yeah,
and it was I could feel it starting, but it was just horrible timing, and from that, it was ultimately not a good thing for me.
Yeah, and sometimes we truncate the process that was available to us at the time, and it makes the road a little harder, maybe, or a little longer. And there's a cost for that sometimes, and I think that's what you experienced, right? So, yeah. So grief is a complicated animal, and that service
plays by its own rules.
That service was incredible in the sense that it was a very healthy expression and a very amazing experience, even as from my experience of it, just the sense of just the honesty and the healthiness of that open expression of grief, and I think that's what was so special about it. But you were in professional mode, so you had a hard time reconnecting that. So I don't know how to transition this because those of you who know, go ahead.
I've got an idea if we're going to move into the main thing we were getting to. You look like you were starting to transition though. Do you have your thing? Go do your thing.
Nah,
I've talked a lot. Oh.
Yeah. So okay. So sometimes in the midst of grief, you need to lighten the moment. You need God to provide some humor. And so those of you who know our experience, my family's experience, my mom and dad were hit by a drunk driver in 2015. My mom died in the accident, in the crash. And it was a very crazy time. We all rushed back to Pennsylvania. In the midst of that, we had to care for my dad, who was hospitalized with some pretty severe injuries. And a good friend of mine here in Modesto had prayed that God would give us some sort of just moments of lightheartedness, as weird as that sounds, just to lighten the grief and the burden and the pain. And that prayer was answered in several ways. And my favorite moment of that was we had gone to visit my dad in the hospital. We'd spend all day. It was an hour away from where my parents had lived. We would spend all day at the hospital with him and my siblings and I. Cindy and I were there, and my sister from Texas and my brother from Ohio, all present. That particular day, Cindy and I stayed the longest, and my cousin, who had been such an amazing part of our family support during that time, had driven many hours, about 2.5, 3 hours, to be with us and to visit my dad, and she had provided a huge amount of homemade delicious food because she knew that we were going back to an empty house with no food and that we weren't just in any shape to prepare our own food. So she had gone to a lot of work to bring a giant bag of food and
Halupkis?
I don't remember. You'll understand why I don't remember and why I never got to experience. So we went out to dinner afterwards. We visited my dad, and before we all drove to our separate locations in Pennsylvania, she said, "Hey, let's grab some dinner so we can talk a little bit." And so we went to a local restaurant there and had a very nice dinner. And as we walked out to the car, my sister and Patty were about the same age, and so they had a lot of common experiences. They were just chatting and visiting, and Patty said, "Let me get that food from my car." And so we walked to Patty's car and got this giant bag of food, and Cindy and Patty are just talking and talking and talking, and so Cindy just takes the bag and I'm relieving Lansing at this point, so I'm not even nearby. I'm off in a little grassy patch with my guide dog Lansing, and Cindy puts the food in the vehicle, continues the talk. I come back, we jump in the car, we drive an hour back to my parents' house, and as we're getting out of the car, I'm like, I'll grab that food from the back. I open up the hatch, there was no food. I was like, Cindy, where'd you put the food? And she goes, it's back there. And there was no food. Yeah, she had, in her distracted state, she had opened somebody else's car.
No!
And just put the food in some stranger's vehicle.
And it's Western Pennsylvania.
Yeah, because people don't lock their cars in Western Pennsylvania.
Oh.
The car was open, and it looked like the vehicle we were driving, so she just didn't even think about it. She just opened somebody else's car, stuck this giant bag of food in there.
I desperately want to hear the story from their angle.
Yeah, exactly. So imagine yourself going to a restaurant, having a lovely meal, going out to your car, and you maybe don't notice it until you get home, or maybe the next day you find this giant cooler bag type thing with all kinds of yummy food.
Oh no!
Would you eat it or not? Yeah, just some random stranger puts a bag of food in your car. So
somebody's going to a lot of effort to poison us.
So those moments happen in the midst of grief, in the midst of terrible, terrible suffering and pain. There was a joyful moment that we have harassed my sister about for years, because yes, we then had to tell my cousin, not only did we not get to enjoy all your homemade food, but you don't get your containers back.
You didn't do the sitcom storyline of pretending you ate it. And,
No.
Oh, what was your favorite part?
No, the Ralston family tends to have not only honesty but a really good sense of humor, and so we're like, yeah, this is a great story. We're telling this one for years, which we have because it was 5 years ago.
That's amazing.
So grief happens in humor is really helpful in the midst of grief. So look for those moments. I know they're hard to find. I know they're ridiculous sometimes to even think about that, but those can really, I don't know, just it really helps in the midst of the pain to understand there's still a ray of sunshine that gets in every now and then, and so that really helps. So that was my little grief humor experience.
So one of the things I wrote down in my unqualified observations about grief is the body and soul experience grief when they need to, and the subject of your grief might not fit tidily into any particular category. And the example I wrote down is a young widow would not just grieve the loss of her husband, but also the decades together that they might have shared and the kids that they might have parented. And, it's not just the loss of the person, it's the loss of this life together. And that kind of grief would really follow through with them. Oh, it's been 18 years. Our kid would have been graduating high school. Grief doesn't necessarily always fit into the proper little tidy categories. And that's one of the things that might be difficult to express about grief when you're trying to find that person to be a sounding board for you.
Yeah, and that's exactly right, because grief is so complicated in so many layers, in that you're grieving, yes, the loss of the loved one, but there's so many other components of that. And I think we underestimate that sometimes, and we think that, okay, it's been X amount of time, I'm over the passing of that person. No, there's still a whole bunch of things you're grieving because of the experiences lost, or the years lost, or the whatever emotions that will come later. That's a big part of it too.
It doesn't just have to do with death.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to do with death. It has to do with lost opportunity and loss in general. That's why I often talk about grief as loss and grief together, because sometimes the loss is a component we don't talk about.
There's a bunch of high school seniors right now that have been looking forward to prom for some of them for 10 years.
Yeah, so that's kind of what sparked this for me. Was I've been thinking about and praying about grief a lot over the last few months, because I think this last 3 months has caused a lot of grief that people aren't talking about necessarily, or maybe not dealing with seriously.
They don't feel there's an opening to talk about it. Maybe.
Yeah, those who've lost experiences, be it a graduation service, a prom, those who are 18, those who are in college and lost a freshman year, a sophomore year, a senior year, those who maybe went into the military and were hoping that their loved ones would be able to come watch them graduate at boot camp or visit them at certain times, and that was lost. Those of you who had big vacation plans. I have some good friends that were planning a 25th anniversary trip to Italy, kind of a trip of a lifetime, and all that was lost.
Grandparents who don't get to see their grandkids for months at a time that would have normally been super involved.
And just to bring it to Centenary, those of you who were looking forward to the last few months of Pastor Bob's ministry here at Centenary, his last Easter, his last Mother's Day, Father's Day kind of services, a whole lot of stuff that would have happened in April, May, and June that didn't happen. And even though we're trying to do the best we can, there's a loss there. There's a significant loss that
there would have been a significant loss even if we'd been able to do the whole farewell routine.
Right. Right.
It would still be a very healthy thing to grieve this guy retiring that's been so involved and so instrumental in people's lives and faith.
So we're grieving on a number of levels. We're grieving all the things we've lost because of the pandemic. We're grieving the loss of normality, and then even when we come back to church, it's not going to be what you remember from church a few months ago.
True.
It's just not. And then Pastor Bob's leaving is a whole nother transition of grieving the loss of a beloved shepherd who's been here. Cheryl and Bob have been here for 22 years, and their connection with many in our congregation, and there's so many things like that are happening now, and I just worry sometimes that we're not talking about it enough because we just think we need a stiff upper lip and just plow through and just be strong, and as Christians I think it's okay to grieve as long as we remember we grieve with hope. We don't grieve as those who've lost their hope. We grieve as those who have a confident expectation that God will make all this He'll use all this for our good. Somehow he'll bring all this for the good of those who love him. Even the loss and the pain and the suffering, nothing will be wasted in the end. And so the idea there is, can you trust God and grieve with hope, even when you didn't get this experience that you would really hope for at this particular time for whatever reason. And that's okay to talk about that, to pray about that, to give that to Jesus, and be honest about that. It's okay to talk about that and own those feelings, and God can handle your strong emotions. He made them. So if you're having, and I think for some of us, that's where this weird anxiety is coming from, is because we haven't maybe confronted the grief issues that are going on, the loss issues that are going on in the last few months. And maybe that would help us if we did. So,
and we know we're upset.
Yeah.
We might not necessarily be able to trace it back to the source and, find that opportunity to grieve.
Yeah. So again, start with prayer, start with asking the Holy Spirit to help you, and then it's okay to talk about it with a trusted friend or a loved one and just kind of say, hey, yeah, this has been a rough stretch, and you don't want to get stuck in the grief. You don't want to let yourself kind of wallow in the grief and the loss forever, but it's okay to focus on it and work through it, and with God's help, heal you from that. And again, grief is a serious wound, loss is a wound, and if you let God heal you, it doesn't make it all better. It's not going to be like it was, but the grief, the wound heals into a scar. And scars are okay because they're reminders that God loves us, and it's okay. So I know that's very, very, I don't know, I'm not summarizing it well, but you know what I mean.
And you might not know a good person in your life that you can think of to be a good sounding board for your grief to share this with, but there's two guys on this podcast, one of whom has had training in grief counseling. We'd love to hear from you. If you just because you email us doesn't mean we need to talk about it on the podcast. You can email us and just say, can I talk to you? Can you connect me with somebody? We've got a wonderful Stephen ministry at this church. Brian, would you like to mention anything about that?
Yeah. Yes, we have great Stephen ministers who would walk with you, who are trained to walk with you as confidential listeners and confidential prayer warriors, and that can really help you. We can also recommend a lot of other resources, and so if this situation in the last few months has caused some loss, or maybe there's grief even from the past that has been reopened, and you thought you had worked through it, but this all brought it back somehow. We want to help if that's necessary, so please don't necessarily think you're alone, because you're not. So as we close this topic, just know that as believers, we are called to grieve with hope. That Paul says grieving is normal, and go back to 1 Thessalonians 4:13. But we don't grieve like those in the world. We grieve as those who have Jesus. We have hope. We have a confident expectation God keeps his promises. So build your life on that firm foundation and nothing else. So jump into the Word of God, and we appreciate you listening.
Come pie.
One last word before we go.
And one last word before we go, email us, centenary1911@gmail.com, because we love hearing from people. It makes us so happy. And this Sunday, we've got another Centenary live stream. You can watch it at centenarychurch.net/live, and it starts at 10 a.m. And the following Sunday, June 21st, our first live services will resume, and please let us know if you're going to be there, because that's helpful. Brian, say something. I'm panicking.
In-person services on June 21st.
Dang it, in-person.
Look forward to that,
Sorry,
everybody.
language. Gee golly. In-person services.
There you go. Thanks for joining us. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Yours.